All right, we're taking up the next life now. This should be very interesting for all of you. Very interesting. Life number 1 on Atlantis, male, 10,400 BC. It was the time of decline on Atlantis. The continent had split into 6 provinces. Cities were decaying. Parts were overgrown and unsafe to enter. Guerrilla bands controlled sections of the provinces. Industrial plants sat idle and were breaking apart. Vestiges of representative government remained, but real power lay in various military leaders. This person incarnated as the first son in a military family. His father was the soul who would later incarnate as Joseph Stalin. As son, he organized a military takeover of the largest province. He disbanded the elected government. Although he promised to improve conditions, he created a totalitarian state. He set up prison camps for the indigent or indolent. He drove farmers from their land under the pretext that the government could work the land more efficiently with larger equipment. This uprooted people who moved to the cities. The province ended up a dictatorship with wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. Classes were divided into the very rich and the very poor. A new serf class arose. It was a dismal time. He died after ruling for 30 years. Life number 2, Atlantis, male. He was reborn in one of his own slave labor camps. He died at age 10. Life number 3, Egypt, male. He was a slave working on building a pyramid, not the pyramids at Giza. Nikita Khrushchev and Joseph Stalin were his bosses. They were over him. He was rewarded by them for being the hardest working slave and put in a position as foreman. He rose rapidly through the ranks as a capable administrator. He knew how to give the right combination of encouragement and the lash. He listened to other people's problems. He was poisoned by Khrushchev, who was jealous that he was gaining too much power. He died of this poisoning. Life number 4, ancient Greece. He was born into a noble family. He became skilled in debate. He learned to sway popular opinion. He contributed to the downfall of Greece. He was cruel to slaves. He caused some to have their legs tied together at the knees for punishment. 6 of them later became cripples and had to beg for a living. He had a wife but no children. Life number 5, North Africa, 900 AD. He was a black slave in a Muslim state. He worked in the fields during the first part of his life. He was castrated by the owner. Nevertheless, he loved a beautiful slave girl. In later life, a cart went out of control and knocked him over. The wheels ran over his legs at the knee, and he could never walk again. His master was kind and took care of him until he died. Life number 6, Denmark, 12th century, female. Her name is Tekka. Her husband is a fisherman. She spent a devoted life caring for his nets. They had 10 children. During middle age, she had been active in community affairs and organizing a system of preparing for and responding to storms. At old age, she was shipwrecked and rescued, but died soon after. Life number 7, Britain, 1789-1814, female. She was a young girl of noble family. She died of tuberculosis at age 25. No husband or children. Life number 8, America, male, 1824-1878. He was born to a New York banking family. He was involved in efforts to establish a central bank, apart from the government. He was involved in the efforts to begin the Civil War for the purposes of greater profits. He was killed by a runaway horse carriage in the streets of New York. Guess who this is? Can you speak up a little louder? Somebody already said it, so you have to repeat. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born into a wealthy, politically powerful, and socially prominent family on January 30th, 1882. He was the only child of his father's second marriage. The Roosevelts had been in the country since the 17th century. Their wealth came from a sugar refinery and real estate. By the time Franklin was born, his father, James, was a prominent member of New York society. His mother's father had become wealthy through opium trade with China. Children of the rich and powerful often gravitate to positions of power. Franklin attended Harvard and married his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, in 1905. He was elected to the state Senate in 1910 and re-elected in 1912. Between 1913 and 1920, he served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. In 1918, Eleanor discovered that he was having an affair with Lucy Mercer, her former social secretary. Lucy supplied Franklin with a gay companionship that was missing in his relationship with Eleanor. Elliott Roosevelt later recalled that his parents enjoyed very few light moments. They never enjoyed anything in the way of lightheartedness in their lives, he said. Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce, but he instead broke off the affair. Although they resumed their marriage, Eleanor was deeply hurt and their lives were never the same. Elliott referred to their marriage after the affair as a partnership arrangement. In 1921, Roosevelt was stricken with polio and was paralyzed from the waist down. You can see that as a recall of his having injured those various individuals, binding the slaves at the knees. We always come back to pay our debts. The more you see these lifetimes, the more you realize that not one jot or tittle of the law passes away until we fulfill that law of karma. In 1924, he resumed his legal career and re-entered public life. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York. In 1932, he received the Democratic nomination for president. He campaigned on a platform of relief, recovery, and reform. As soon as he was sworn in, Roosevelt called Congress into special session, and in 100 days they passed the massive, far-reaching legislation known as the New Deal. From 1933 to 1945, he served as the 32nd President of the United States. When he took office, 13 million people were unemployed and the banking structure was collapsing. Millions heard his confident words over the radio. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He was able to galvanize the public behind his reforms with his informal and relaxed fireside chats over the radio. His New Deal legislation was passed with lightning speed. It included the creation of numerous federal agencies such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Public Works Administration. He put people back to work, and they were grateful. However, in 1935 and 1936, the Supreme Court declared some New Deal legislation unconstitutional. Roosevelt proposed adding new justices to the court. Many people felt that he was simply trying to pack the court and undermine its separation of powers function. Roosevelt met with his first major legislative defeat. The legacy of the New Deal has been hotly debated almost since it was enacted. On the positive side, it gave people hope in one of America's darkest hours. In the short run, it addressed some of the acute problems of unemployment, but it had negative consequences as well. First, it was not an effective economic program. By 1937, the economy was still in the doldrums, and many of the structural economic and social problems we have today can be traced, at least in part, to New Deal policies. For example, on April 19, 1933, Roosevelt took the nation off the gold standard. That enabled politicians and bankers to manipulate the economy through monetary and fiscal policy. If we had the economic discipline of the gold standard, we would not have a deficit problem of the magnitude that we have today. The New Deal vastly increased the power of the federal bureaucracy. Tax and spend liberalism, so unpopular today, took firm hold during the Roosevelt years. Today, it is widely recognized that the federal government is often the problem rather than the solution. Most people recognize the need for some kind of social welfare assistance, but they also recognize that many government programs are simply out of control. While the failure of government programs cannot all be laid at the feet of Roosevelt, they had their roots in New Deal legislation. After World War II began, Roosevelt built up American strength and made the country into an arsenal for democracy. He led the nation victoriously through World War II. One of the key relationships of Roosevelt's life was his relationship with Joseph Stalin. Most historians agree that he completely misjudged Stalin. During the war, he attempted to befriend Stalin. He bent over backwards to convince him that he could trust the West. As his advisor Averell Harriman later wrote, he was determined, establishing a close personal relationship with Stalin in wartime, to build confidence among the Kremlin leaders that Russia, now an acknowledged major power, could trust the West. George Kennan, one of America's foremost modern diplomats, wrote, I also have in mind FDR's evident conviction that Stalin, while perhaps a somewhat difficult customer, was only, after all, a person like any other person. That the reason we hadn't been able to get along with him in the past was that we had never really had anyone with a proper personality and the proper qualities of sympathy and imagination to deal with him, and that if only he could be exposed to the persuasive charms of someone like FDR himself, ideological preconceptions would melt, and Stalin's cooperation with the West could easily be arranged. For these assumptions, there were no grounds whatsoever, and they were of a puerility unworthy of a statesman of FDR's stature. End of quote by Kennan. Roosevelt told his longtime friend William Bullitt, I think if I give him, Stalin, everything I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of peace and democracy. End of quote by Bullitt. Even when the Soviets violated the Yalta agreements in the spring of 1945, Roosevelt continued to court Stalin. Roosevelt made many concessions to Stalin throughout the war. At Yalta, he gave the Soviet Union territories in Japan and China in exchange for Stalin's agreement to enter the war against Japan. The decisions at Yalta permitted the creation of Soviet-style governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, as you well know. Stalin agreed to free and unfettered elections in Poland as early as possible. After the war, free elections never happened in Poland, and the Soviet puppet government remained in power. Winston Churchill and Roosevelt had greatly differing views of the post-war future of Europe. Churchill's private dream was to establish a United States of Europe, excluding the Soviet Union, in which the barriers between nations will be greatly minimized and unrestricted travel will be possible. Roosevelt, on the other hand, in a conversation with Francis Cardinal Spellman, revealed that he had no compunctions whatsoever about abandoning Europe to Stalin. He said that the European people would simply have to endure Russian domination in the hope that in 10 or 20 years, the European influence would bring the Russians to become less barbarous. Roosevelt here revealed himself an elitist to the core. Privately, Churchill opposed the Yalta Agreement, the Declaration on Liberated Europe, but he supported it publicly so as not to endanger his alliance with America. Churchill opposed the Yalta Agreement. Another example of Roosevelt's mad pursuit of friendship with Stalin was his refusal to press Stalin to help the Poles. This was a time when the Polish Home Army was being slaughtered by the Germans, while Stalin's Red Army sat on the other side of the Vistula River and watched. Kennan wrote of Roosevelt's attitude toward Poland, quote, one gets the impression that it seemed to FDR of little importance whether these areas were Polish or Russian. His anxiety was rather that he had a large body of voting constituents in this country of Polish or Baltic origin. End of quote by Kennan. Roosevelt saw greater danger in British imperialism than Soviet imperialism, despite the fact that the Soviets had recently slaughtered millions of their own people. Whose side was he really on, anyway? You can see these relationships having been formed a long time ago, and the absolute need of FDR for that father figure, to have that father figure, and to please that father figure. Remember, millions lost their lives for the liberation of Europe. And at the end of the war, the Soviets were handed over Eastern Europe by a treaty that Churchill didn't want, but that Roosevelt forced on him and that Stalin lapped up. So it is a very serious karma here, the karma of one individual who causes the enslaving of the European nations of Eastern Europe up until these very last few years, when they have finally some sense of freedom, but really very little freedom because their economies and their nations have been spoiled, they've been sacked, they've been looted, they've been had. And the peoples of these East European nations are perfectly capable of the free enterprise system. America is filled with peoples from these nations. And all these years, all of our lives, till very recently, till the turning of the decade of the 1990s, these people have been under the harshest rule, secret police, armies of the USSR, because one man had this bent in his personality. This is when you begin to ask yourself, who is FDR? Where did he come from? And how could one man so distort the flame of freedom and the flame of liberty for so many millions of people for so long? We take the next life, the next individual. Life number 1, Atlantis, male. He lived in the very distant past when Atlantean tribes were first uniting to form a collective government. He was a leader who organized 4 tribes to fight together and establish a joint government. The coalition fell apart when he demanded one of the wives of the other leaders. When the leader refused, he took that wife anyway. War resulted. This is how the abduction took place. He sent a picked band of men to abduct her from her tent one night. The men killed 6 guards, creeping up through the dust and slitting their throats with sharp stone knives. Later, the war went against his tribe. In an outburst of anger at him for his folly, the tribe sacrificed both him and his new wife to the gods. Each was tied separately on a platform of wood. Their stomachs were sliced open. They were left to have their organs eaten by birds until they perished. Life number 2, Atlantis, male. Again, he became a military leader. The time was about 10,900 BC. It was sometime after Philos the Tibetan, for those familiar with his story. He was a member of the military council responsible for the nation of Atlantis. Tribes from the north were threatening one of Atlantis' most prosperous provinces. This leader favored negotiation and tried to work out a settlement with the tribes. It was a time of economic difficulty and civic strife, and so his settlement was popular because troops would not have to be committed to defend the province. When the tribes invaded the province, slaughtered every man in the capital city, and took the women and children as slaves, this man was devastated. He resigned from office. He was deserted by everyone, friends, wife, and children. He ended up committing suicide. He threw himself off a white marble bridge into one of the capital city's narrow ravines. It was rocky with a shallow stream at the bottom. He was killed instantly. Life number 3, Atlantis, male. He was reborn as a slave in the last days of Atlantis and was forced to perform menial labor in the fields. This was a partial paying off of his karma for the military disaster when the Atlantean province was invaded by the northern tribes. He was taken by his master to the American continent to watch over his affairs there. The master returned to Atlantis, leaving him in charge of a mining operation. Soon after, the Atlantean continent sank. Thus, he was one of the few Atlanteans to survive the sinking of the continent. After Atlantis sank, he helped to organize a primitive government among the survivors. He lived to an honorable age and was respected for his ideas. In middle age, he met his twin flame, but she was married to someone else. She acknowledged him, but went with her husband. He never married. Life number 4, ancient South American civilization, female. She was abducted from her father's home. A rival tribe forced her to serve as a prostitute when she was young. When she grew older, she was sent to do menial labor in the fields. In old age, she was assigned to help care for the daughter of the king. This was the same soul she or he had abducted on Atlantis. This was her opportunity to pay off some of the karma for the abduction and subsequent death of the woman on Atlantis. She gave great love and affection to this girl and developed a bond with her. She was buried with honor when she died. Life number 5, southwestern United States, 5000 BC, female. She belonged to a tribe that lived peacefully together. Her husband was the woman she had abducted on Atlantis, her twin flame. They had a happy and productive life. She bore 5 children and raised them all to a healthy adulthood. She passed her test of learning to nurture and serve life. Life number 6, Far East, male. He became a great warlord. His major test was the use of power. He passed some tests and failed others. He was responsible for cruel torture and the institution of brutal punishment of criminals throughout his province. He had a favorite concubine, but he ordered her death after hearing rumors of her infidelity. He believed the gossip. He had really loved her and was quick to believe the rumors because he did not want to be humiliated. He ordered her head, hands, and feet cut off and her body thrown to the dogs. He accomplished some good in this life. He made a truce with other warlords and presided over an era of peace and prosperity, and he fought several brilliant battles. Before coming to power, he publicly humiliated his enemies and caused their downfall by rumor and gossip. This was karma he would have to pay off in future lives. Life number 7, England, 1650 to 1722, male. He was John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. John Churchill has been called one of the greatest military commanders in history. He was born on May 26, 1650. At age 15, he served as a page to the Duke of York, who was later crowned King James II. When Churchill was 17, he received a commission in the Foot Guards and began a successful military career. He married Sarah Jennings for love, not money. Although they eventually became extremely wealthy, they had very little money to begin with. Churchill remained in the service of the Duke of York, carrying out confidential assignments for him and accompanying him when he was in exile. He later switched his allegiance from the Catholic James II to the Protestant William of Orange. James II was expelled from England and William of Orange became King William III. William III rewarded Churchill's allegiance by making him the Earl of Marlborough. He was also given military rank and a succession of commands in Flanders and in Ireland between 1689 and 1691, in which he was uniformly successful. He was imprisoned for a short time in the Tower of London on suspicion of working toward the restoration of the exiled James II. Marlborough's influence at court increased when Queen Anne came to the throne after William's death. She made him the Duke of Marlborough. The Duchess of Marlborough became a close advisor and friend of the Queen. Together, the Marlboroughs were a central power beside the Queen. The Duke's reputation as a military general was unrivaled until Napoleon. He was also a successful diplomat. He created and maintained the alliance of nations that opposed the French King Louis XIV. Marlborough was a Tory, a conservative who supported the crown, the court, and the church. As the old Tories began to leave government, the Marlboroughs advocated an alliance with the Whigs, who wanted to limit the authority of the crown. The Queen strongly disliked the Whigs. The Duchess's influence on the Queen diminished. The Duke was accused of misappropriating public funds and dismissed from office. They left the country and settled abroad. When George I succeeded Queen Anne to the throne, he restored Churchill to favor. Churchill returned to England, but he no longer played an active role in public affairs. He died at Windsor on June 16, 1722. Life number 8, Malaysia, late 18th and early 19th centuries, male. He became an enlightened ruler known for wise practices often exceeding the standards of his time and place. He repaid his past karma for executing his concubine. She was reincarnated as his wife, and he raised her up and educated her. Later, he gave her honors and wealth. In this lifetime, he also treated other slaves kindly, reduced punishments, motivated people to produce better harvests, and instituted a system of fair taxation. Can you guess who this subject was in this century? I thought you could take a hint. Winston Churchill. That often happens, you know. You actually wind up having the same name in different lifetimes. It's funny. This is an amazing life. He lived 1874 to 1965. There are a number of parallels with his life as the Duke of Marlborough. For example, he switched parties from liberal to conservative and back again, just as Marlborough switched his allegiance. Winston Churchill actually wrote a biography of Marlborough that painted him in a more favorable light than other biographies. Nothing like doing up your past life. Winston's father was a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough. His mother was an American, the daughter of a New York financier. As a young man, he served in the British Army in India and Egypt. He also worked as a correspondent in Cuba and South Africa. He wrote books on his experiences and supported himself on the income from the books. That's better than a nice nin did. At age 25, he was elected to Parliament as a conservative. He lost popularity when he joined the Liberal Party in 1904. Most likely, the reason he switched allegiance was because he disagreed with the conservative leadership's position on trade. They supported a tariff while he believed in free trade. In 1908, he married the beautiful Clementine Hosier. They were happily married for life. This marriage provided a stable basis for Churchill's turbulent career. Wasn't his daughter named Sarah in this life? And you notice that had been his wife before, his wife's name. In 1911, he became First Lord of the Admiralty. He realized that Germany was planning to launch a war when she safely could. Consequently, he began to strengthen the British fleet to prepare for possible war. He was blamed for 3 important defeats in the war: at Antwerp in the Dardanelles and in Gallipoli. But it was later realized that he had not been given either the power or the logistical support to make the campaigns a success. Thus, he was not really to blame. Nevertheless, he resigned from government in 1915. He returned to public office as the Minister of Munitions in 1917. He greatly increased the production of war materiel and supported the development of the tank. The tank later became the weapon that broke through the deadlock on the Western Front. We can see him step by step undoing the karma of allowing the Atlantean province to be invaded without defense. His soul never forgot. His soul took responsibility for that failure, and this time he would do it right. Between 1921 and 22, Churchill served as colonial secretary. He helped negotiate the treaty that created the Irish Free State and was involved in resolving problems in the Middle East. However, he opposed self-rule for India and Burma. In 1924, he returned to the Conservative Party. In 1925, Churchill put Great Britain back on the gold standard. The economy reacted violently. There was deflation, a rise in unemployment, and a miners' strike. Churchill was blamed for the problems. In 1929, the Conservatives were voted out, and Churchill spent the next 10 years out of office. During this time, he perceived that Nazism, fascism in Italy, and communism in Russia were threats to democracy. He opposed Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of disarmament and belief in the mirage of world peace. Churchill urged military preparation, but few listened. When World War II broke out, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. Chamberlain was forced to resign when Germany invaded the Low Countries. Churchill became Prime Minister and brilliantly led Britain through the war. Thus, he balanced his karma from the 2 debacles on Atlantis. He had his shortcomings. He was overly bombastic at times. His inability to oppose Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta and Potsdam resulted in the enslavement of Eastern Europe. He lost friends through unwillingness to compromise and being too outspoken, but he passed the test of preferring right over popularity that he had failed on Atlantis by allowing the province to be invaded and destroyed. He married his twin flame and paid the remainder of the karma he had of abducting her on Atlantis and causing her death. He has returned to embodiment. I didn't tell you at the end of Anais Nin that she is on the 14th level of the astral plane. So you can see that the law is just. People cannot parade around in defiance of God and misleading a generation of women without paying the price. But what is the price? The fact of the matter is that she spent lifetimes on the astral plane. You can be on the astral plane in physical embodiment. The astral plane is a state of consciousness. That is where she created her books and her writings. That is where she lived her life. And so she was in death as she was in life, in that same state of consciousness. About Roosevelt, I am not at liberty to tell you. This next person is a woman today. And so her first life, we go back to Lemuria, the continent that sank beneath the Pacific. She is female. Lemuria sank about 12,500 years ago, or about 1,000 years before the sinking of Atlantis. At one time, she was high priestess in the temple of the Divine Mother on Lemuria. It was a time of religious decline. On the positive side, she convinced many people to return to worship. She focused a greater flame in Lemuria and prolonged the civilization. On the negative side, she convinced the government to institute a policy of coercion in religious worship. Peasants were forced to go to the temple, sometimes at the point of a spear. Life number 2, Atlantis, male. He had the choice to pursue a career in the priesthood or in government. He chose government and became a prominent legislator. He advocated reform in the laws concerning slaves. He was able to make conditions better for slaves and actually instituted a 10-year process whereby a slave could free himself. His private life was a tragedy. During middle age, he fell in love with a daughter of a fellow legislator. He arranged for his wife to be murdered. He ordered a slave to push her over a wall of the garden surrounding their house. The slave confessed to authorities out of feelings of guilt. The legislator was publicly tried and resigned in disgrace. He was exiled to a small island where he lived out his life. The slave was executed. The wife he had ordered killed is one of his children today. The slave is the other. The young girl he was in love with is her twin flame, and she is married to him today. To get these he's and she's straightened out. I'm using the pronoun for the life I'm talking about. So this next life is a female. Life number 3 on Atlantis. The karma for killing his wife, her wife, was set aside so that he could become yet another public servant. This is one of the amazing acts of grace that God gives us, that the Lords of Karma give us, that life gives us. It is that when we go before the Lords of Karma and we are penitent and desirous of atoning for our deeds, they will set aside karma so that we can go forth, keep our word, make good, and create a positive momentum of good karma before we have to deal with the descent of the negative karma. So good karma is like money in the bank. It's energy in your causal body. And so God has done this, I'm certain, for all of us at one time or another, where we have sinned and then been profoundly remorseful, and we could go on and serve to set life free, and then come to the time, such as this life, when we would have the violet flame and opportunity and understanding and enlightenment, so that we could deal with some of the harsher realities of our karma and deal with them with our eyes wide open that we will get through this and we will get beyond this karma, because God is just and because we do have the violet flame. So this time he embodied as a woman on Atlantis. She became a scientist and organized and implemented a new sanitation system for the towns and cities. It eliminated the need for sewer pipes. All waste was processed in the home and either used for energy or picked up by municipal garbage authorities once a month. In private life, she never married. She had a series of affairs in early life. She was unable to develop a stable relationship with anyone because of the sad ending to her past life. Life number 4, Rome, 1st century, male. He was a famous senator who was directly and indirectly responsible for the death of many people. In his early years, he was a soldier stationed on Crete. He raped a girl there. As a senator, he made positive and negative contributions to society. On the positive side, he fought for the enfranchisement of more citizens. On the negative side, he compromised for the sake of politics. He threw his power with the group that lost. There was an uprising. Soldiers came out to crush it. He was exhorting the people to return home and not to revolt. However, he was still seen as a leader of the revolt. As he exhorted the people from the second story of the house, soldiers appeared behind him and stabbed him just behind the collarbone. The lesson he learned was to be careful of which party you side with and not to side with a cause you don't really believe in for the sake of politics. And that is a very important lesson that we all learn on the playground at a very early age. In private life, he had a devoted wife and 5 children. They survived him. His wife was the one he had ordered to be killed before. He balanced some karma by achieving an intimate, loving relationship with her. He also had mistresses. Life number 5, Crete, female. Embodied as a slave to pay back some of the karma he had incurred by raping a girl on Crete. She served as a concubine to a wealthy farmer. The farmer was the reincarnation of the girl he had raped as a Roman soldier. And so it goes. Karma keeps on intertwining, isn't it amazing? Life number 6, Britain, male. He was a member of Parliament during the English Civil War, 1642 to 51. He was on the side of Oliver Cromwell and the Parliament. He opposed King Charles I. He was one of the participants in the Rump Parliament, which tried and condemned Charles I to death. Life number 7, Britain, male. He was an oil merchant in London. He got into debt and was forced out of business by greedy competitors. He was reduced to life as a beggar. Eventually, he was murdered and dumped in the Thames. His wife and children starved and died. In this life, he was repaying the karma for a Roman merchant he had ordered to be ruined. The merchant had begged for mercy, but he had no mercy. Life number 8, Britain, female. She was born in England but emigrated with her parents to North Carolina during the 1840s. She became a school teacher. During the Civil War, she helped to organize and care for the wounded and dying. She used her money to help the sick and bereaved. Many of those whom she helped were those she owed karmic debts to from her life as a Roman senator. She had an ill-fated romance. She met her twin flame during the war. He was killed. She spent only one night with him. She never married. It is often that we have a very brief encounter with our twin flame in a lifetime, and it is a mercy and a grace that is given to us, because by reestablishing the heart tie, it sets the sail and the momentum, the direction for them finding one another in the next or the next life, where they can be together for a lifetime or for a greater amount of time. You can always see the mercy of the law side by side with the justice of the law if you look for it. Sometimes people forget to say to themselves, it could have been worse. It might have been much worse. Sometimes we're only looking at just how bad things are and not realizing that but for the grace of God, things could be much, much worse that have happened to us in life. Okay, life number 9, who is she? Everybody's whispering. Say something. Thatcher, right, see? Margaret Thatcher, living, 1925. There's Maggie. So beloved by so many people and so hated by so many people. She was the Prime Minister of Britain from 1979 to 1990. Her father, Alfred Roberts, was the shaping influence in her life. He was a grocer, self-taught and well-read. Roberts was always dedicated to the public good. He was thrifty to the point of being parsimonious, fiercely patriotic, a devoted Methodist who preached at church. She said of him, "I owe almost everything to my father. He taught me that you first sort out what you believe in. You then apply it. You don't compromise on things that matter." Now here is an example of someone who has a wonderful relationship to a father that she can admire and respect. I was browsing through a bookstore in New York before I came to Atlanta, and I chanced upon a book that was written about fathers and daughters and how key the relationship of the father to the daughter is to her entire future, her sexuality, her sense of herself as a person. The abandoned daughter suffers almost more than the abandoned son, although the abandoned son also suffers when the father leaves the household. No matter what it costs you as parents, make your peace at some level and stick with your children until they are mature and able to move forward. It is so very important to understand that when you bring forth life, you become responsible for that life, that soul, that psychology, and how they will face the future. Children do not do well without the strong support of both parents. She studied chemistry at Oxford. She married Dennis Thatcher, a well-to-do businessman, in 1951. She began to study law and passed the bar in 1953. She had twins, Mark and Carol, in 1953. She was elected to Parliament in 1959 and held various positions in government until 1975, when she became the leader of the Conservative Party. She attacked socialism for creating a spendthrift society. In May 1979, she became Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the first woman to hold this office. Reviewers of her leadership credit her with having turned around the economy from the wealth-consuming public sector and big unions to the wealth-creating private sector. She initiated the most ambitious privatization venture in the Western world, brought union lawlessness under control, held inflation in check, and revived the private sector by promoting market competition. She resigned in November 1990 after her popularity ratings fell to 23%. The primary issue over which she resigned was the poll tax, a flat tax on everyone in a local community, regardless of each person's income. The amount of the poll tax was to be decided by the local community based on its financial needs. Local governments set the taxes much higher than expected, and Thatcher was the target of the people's blame. Britain was also suffering from increasing unemployment and rising inflation. Polls showed that people thought Thatcher was out of touch with the common people and that she talked down to them. She remains a powerful force in global politics. She was one of the few people who had the courage to say that the civil war in Yugoslavia is a moral issue and that the world has a duty to come to the aid of the Croats and the Bosnians. El Morya assigned the embodiments of those we are studying today. So, I am not the one that picked these embodiments, and the last one that El Morya assigned to me is my own. I am very grateful to be able to give you these embodiments because you've heard here and there snatches of where I've been in the past and what I've been doing. But I too, of course, have a karmic record, and I'm very happy to be able to bring to you the record of my karma so that you could understand a scene that began more than 30,000 years ago and thousands of years beyond that. I'm not bringing you all of my lifetimes, but key lifetimes, and especially those that have shaped me, molded me, brought me to many situations. You know, people think erroneously in the New Age, for instance, that we choose our parents. Well, yes, we choose them in the sense that we make karma with people, and therefore we have to be born through them. If making karma is a choice, and of course it always is a choice. So you really don't get to pick your parents until you are karma-free. And even then you are advised by your dharma, which is your calling in life, your duty to be yourself, who the best family would be for you. So that is no reflection on my story of my life, but it is simply a statement that once we begin making karma, we are no longer the arbiters of our destiny. The guiding hand of the lords of karma and our mentors is taking us to the place where we must be to fulfill that round of negative or positive karma. So I will begin, since the hour is late. First of all, I remember leaving the great central sun. I remember going before Alpha and Omega in the great throne room, bowing before them, and asking their leave to go and descend into the lower octaves, where the rebel angels, those who had rebelled against God and his Christ, were moving against the children of light. And I specifically asked permission if I could go and find them and woo them back to God. I received the blessing of beloved Alpha and Omega to do this. And this is the teaching that they gave me before I departed. It was that I would go forth, and for many long centuries, I would be mother to them and teacher to them. But when their time would be fulfilled, as I explained to you last night, when their time of opportunity for repentance would come, then I would be in the position of calling forth their judgment. They said to me that the mission did not have great chance of success, but they would support me in my efforts. And they said that these reprobate ones would woo me and flatter me and support me so long as I was to them mother and teacher, but that when the time of their judgment would come, and they, Alpha and Omega, would send me the message that the judgment hour had come, it is then that they would rise up against me and make war against me. And so I remember clearly the record of descending down what I can only describe as a chute of light, like a large tunnel. And I simply went down and down and down until I came to the octaves of earth to which I was sent. Apart from that, which is in a timeless epoch, I cannot give you a date for it, I did journey to earth with Sanat Kumara as part of those who would come and help to establish the rekindling of the threefold flame in those in whom it had gone out. The first life we consider is Atlantis. I was female. I was high priestess of the Divine Mother on Atlantis, and I have a recollection of celebrating the rite of the regeneration of spring. Life number 2 I'm going to give you at the conclusion, so this is 3. Life number 3 is Egypt, 1390 to 1350 BC, female. I was embodied as Nefertiti, the wife of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, originally known as Amenhotep IV. Around the year 1369 BC, Akhenaten converted to the worship of Aton, the one God. Aton is often depicted as a sun disk with rays stretching forth, ending in hands. Akhenaten established the new capital city and started a revolution in art as well as religion. He and his queen officiated as high priest and priestess. They had 6 daughters. Paintings of the king and queen displayed them in many intimate and touching domestic scenes that revealed the depth of their love and the closeness of their family life. Akhenaten issued an ultimatum that all of the old gods, the false gods, must go. He launched a religious war. Akhenaten ordered all idols of Ammon to be destroyed. A rising tide of hatred fed by the priests of Ammon threatened to engulf the royal family. Around the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappeared from public view. She was replaced by Smenkhare, the husband of their eldest daughter. Some believed she was banished to the northern part of the city, others that she withdrew voluntarily. In the 17th year of Akhenaten's reign, he, his wife, Smenkhare, and the eldest daughter disappeared. Scholars have guessed that they were murdered. By whom and when and how is unknown. El Morya has showed me that it was the chief military man, General Horemheb, who led a revolt against Akhenaten and Nefertiti and stabbed them to death. I remember the scene very clearly of running down the halls of a great palace being pursued by the men of Horemheb. After their death, the country reverted to the worship of the old gods of Egypt. Some of you have heard me tell the story of my remembrance at about the age of 4 when I was playing in the sand in my play yard in Red Bank, and that suddenly I was transported and I was playing in the sand on the banks of the Nile River in Egypt. As a child, with my mother tending me, a sense that my mother was royal. This could have been the harking back 33 centuries earlier from this century to the time of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. I believe that it was harking back to that embodiment because this was the century marked by God for Mark Prophet and I to come together and to restore the true worship of the one God and to reveal the knowledge and understanding of the I am that I am. It is said that Moses took his monotheism from the teachings of Akhenaten, of monotheism, of the one God. And of course, Inko was the great god of Atlantis, the one God represented in the sun, and Akhenaten brought that teaching, and he gave the quaint picture of the sun with rays going forth, ending in hands, meaning that we are the hand of God in action. I think it's very important that I had that experience, of course, because I would not have had it without the overshadowing presence of beloved El Morya. It was necessary that I make the tie to the embodiment, a key embodiment in which I made karma, and the karma of which I had to balance in this life, among other karmas. It also brought me back to the tie of the point of the mission to establish the new religion based on the old order of the traditions of the world's major religions. Life number 4, Palestine, 1st century AD, female. I was Jesus' friend and disciple, Martha of Bethany. I lived at Bethany with my brother Lazarus and sister Mary. We were intimate friends of Jesus Christ. He stayed in our home whenever he came to Jerusalem. Those of you who've toured the Holy Land know that Bethany is outside of Jerusalem. Martha was the head of the household and appears to have been the eldest in the family. She cooked for Jesus and looked after his physical needs when he would come. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in her book called Women in Sacred History, Martha was one of those natural leaders whom everybody instinctively thinks of as the head of any house they may happen to belong to. It's a very interesting thing, this Harriet Beecher Stowe, because my childhood playmate in this life was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she had already written about Martha, and then we spent our earliest childhood from age 2 to 9 we were inseparable. Martha is known for her confession of faith in Jesus Christ. It happened after her brother Lazarus had died and Jesus came to Bethany. Martha and Mary had sent word to Jesus when Lazarus became ill, but he did not go to Bethany immediately. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. We read in John chapter 11, "Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, he will give it thee. Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. Strong traditions indicate that following the crucifixion of Jesus, Martha went to France to propagate his teachings. Her relics are in the church dedicated to her in Tarascon, France. Mary, the sister of Martha, re-embodied as Mary Baker Eddy, and brought the teachings of Jesus Christ, Mother Mary, and the Apostle Paul in her Christian Science textbook and writings. What she wrote down, what she received from God, sponsored by Jesus and Paul and Mother Mary, was not the whole truth of divine science. She said that herself. She spoke about her glimpse of divine science, and that the full realization and the full statement of that divine science was yet to come. She distinguished between Christian science, the religion she founded and the church she founded, and divine science as a universal science. When I was shopping for a church in this life between the ages of 7 and 9, I chose the Christian Science Church because, as I told my parents, it was the church that taught me the most about God and Jesus. I am certain that I was drawn to it because it was the highest truth available to me in my town. I have a very great love for Mary Baker Eddy and for Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, a profound devotion to her heart. She is an Ascended Lady Master. Life number 5 in France. About 474 to 545, female. The Queen Clotilde or Clotilda. Daughter of Chilperic, king of the Burgundians of Lyon. Clotilde was a devout Catholic with a very strong belief in God. She married Clovis, king of the Franks, in the year 493. Clovis was drawn to Clotilde because of her widely reputed beauty. Clovis was a pagan at that time. He had heard of this Clotilde, and the story goes that he sent out his messenger to see if she really was what it was said she was. And so he arrived at the castle of her father, and she welcomed him, this messenger, in the Christian tradition of washing his feet. He considered this a sign of humility, took note of her beauty, and arranged for the marriage. The father agreed because it was a powerful alliance for him to have his daughter marry this king. Clotilde knew that her father would soon change his mind. So she arranged to leave quickly as soon as she could be taken to Clovis. And in her anger against her father, what the father had done to either herself or her mother. The history books, I think, may record this. As she was leaving the palace, she set fire to peasant huts of straw that were the homes of the servants of the castle. This in her anger against her father and his treatment of her. This is a very interesting story because very early in my training as a messenger, just a few days before a conference that we were having in Washington, D.C., I was heating some fat at a very high temperature on the stove, and I was pouring the fat from the frying pan into a cup, and I poured it over my hand, and I sustained quite a serious burn. And so I put it in cold water and wrapped it and so forth. And so Mark told me that this was a token of karma that I had incurred because I set fire to those peasants' huts. No one died, but their homes were destroyed. And so it is like a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Sometimes when we have been in the service of God for centuries and performed good deeds, God gives us just a small percentage so that will balance that karma and so that we can learn the lesson of life. This is an example of the mercy of God. I didn't have to have my house burned down in order to pay that karmic debt. But Al Moria said I could not enter that conference and take the lecture platform and stand before the people with that karma on my soul, and therefore it had to be cleared by my experiencing that burning. My hand had a scar for many years, and I was grateful because it could remind me of the mercy of God. And so in this embodiment as Clotilde, I undertook to convert Clovis to the Catholic religion. In the year 496, in the midst of a battle against the Alemanni, Clovis vowed to convert to Catholicism if Clotilde's God would grant him victory. Clovis won the battle and was baptized. Clotilde was thus instrumental in the conversion of the Frankish people to the Catholic faith. After Clovis' death, she spent her life in prayer and good works. I went back to Paris to the Church of Clotilde, who is Saint Clotilde today, and we went there to look at the inside of the church. And it was sometime between 12 and 2 o'clock, and the church was all locked up. And there was a sign on the door that the caretaker was at lunch and we could ring the bell. So we rang the bell, and the bell went way high up, and way, 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 way high up. The caretaker looked out the window, and we said, "Can you let us in? We've come from America to see this church." He said, "No, I'm on my lunch hour. I will not come down and let you in." So I have yet to go back to Paris and see the inside of the church. Life number 6, Denmark, 890 AD, female. This is a life that I've been waiting to tell you about for many years, and El Moria says that I may tell you about this life at this time. There is an indelible memory in my being of this experience. It was one of the darkest hours of my existence. I was born into a family of fishermen. When I grew up, a young fisherman was attracted to me. I was not much interested in him. He went out on a long fishing trip with his father. And I can see the ships coming in, and I can see the women and children going to greet these ships and receive their husbands, their fathers, their sons back from the long trip. So I am seeing them coming off the boat and coming up the path, and I see this one coming toward my house. And I'm in my kitchen and I'm preparing a meal, and I have a carving knife in my hand. I'm cutting up vegetables. So he came into my house as I was preparing this meal, and he came at me and he desired me, and I rebuffed him, and therefore he raped me. and I was outraged. The knife was in my hand, and in my rage against this offense against me, I killed him. This was certainly one of the most tragic events in my history. I lived this life out, and I went before the Lords of Karma, and I can remember that scene very clearly also. I knelt before them, and I was sobbing. And I said to them, I will do anything to balance this karma. I will serve this person as long as you will have me serve him. Let me give him back the life that I took from him. And so the Lords of Karma assigned me to a number of embodiments where I could serve him. The amazing teaching in this matter is that the crime of murder is not justified by the crime of rape. And we must all remember that when we feel the anger within our souls rise up at the violation of our bodies. So this next life was one of the lifetimes in which the Lords of Karma graciously gave me the opportunity to balance this karma. It was Japan. I was female. It was about 900 AD. I was born poor. I was forced to marry a man I did not love, this particular man. He became a cripple. We lived in abject poverty, eating next to nothing. And so I pursued the only trade that I could pursue. I became a prostitute, therefore having to voluntarily give my body to many because I had denied my body to this one. And so this man was the soul I had killed in Denmark, and I had to serve him to balance the karma of murder and also to learn the lesson that this body is the body of God, that God will do what he wills with this body, and I cannot harm another except if the crime is the equivalent. In other words, if someone is about to kill me, I may kill in self-defense if I choose to. But as I said, rape does not justify murder. Again, I returned to Japan. This time it's the year 980, just 80 years later. I am very intent on balancing this karma, and the Lords of Karma are giving me the opportunity. I was married to the same man again. This time, strangely enough, he was a taxidermist and supported us. I served him as his wife. By the end of that life, the karma of the murder was still not paid off. I had to finish paying it off in this life. Isn't it amazing that in a moment of rashness, we can commit a crime that takes us 3 embodiments to pay off? The amazing teaching that I received in this life regarding this situation is that this karma had to be balanced before I could be called to be a messenger for the Ascended Masters. What happened to me then is that I went to Boston. I served in the Christian Science Church, and I saw this young man about 5 years older than I, and he was a leader in the youth fellowship. He headed that. He was a law student. He was part Norwegian and part Swedish. And I would see him walking around, and the first time I saw him a block away, I recognized him. It was simply a recognition. At the same time that I noticed him and recognized him, he recognized me. And it was during this period in my life that I was looking for Saint Germain. I spent 5 years looking for Saint Germain after he quickened my heart and signified his presence when I was leaving home to go to college at 18. So I recognized Saint Germain's picture, and I determined I would find him and I would serve him the rest of my life. And so I thought to myself, I am not finding Saint Germain because I am not ready. Why am I not ready? What am I not doing? What should I be doing? So I thought and thought about it, and I decided the most important thing I must do to find Saint Germain was to be obedient to the voice of God within me. And so I had written all over my college books, on the paper covers that I made for them, obey immediately. I was constantly reminding myself to turn back to the inner voice and to follow the direction of that inner voice. So when I recognized this individual, the inner voice said to me, "You must serve him." I said, "How shall I serve him?" "You can help him in his work, you can help him with the youth group." So I did that. I got to know him. When he was sick, the inner voice said, "Go and take care of him." So I went and I took care of him when he was sick. I kept on receiving these directions of things I should be doing for this person, and I thought, well, this is what I will do. So the day came that he asked me to marry him, and I said, well, you see, I'm looking for Saint Germain, and when I find Saint Germain, I'm going to serve him for the rest of my life. It was kind of meaningless to him. He said, that's fine. You can serve him for the rest of your life. So I said, well, on that condition, I will marry you. So we were married in a small wedding in New Jersey. And when I came down the aisle, I looked up because I heard the voice of God. And the voice of God spoke to me out of my I am presence clearly and said to me, "It is but for a little while." I was stunned by this statement because I had married for keeps, and I believed in my marriage vows. We were both going to school in Boston. I quit school to support him so that he could be in school. Kept house, cooked his meals, and so forth. So I set aside and sacrificed my education so that he could make it. About 10 months later, I had found a little group of students of the Ascended Master's teachings, and they told me that the messenger Mark Prophet was coming from Washington to give a lecture and a dictation. That was April 1961. By that time, I had told my Christian Science teacher about the I Am books. The teacher said to me, well, I saw those books long ago, but I didn't believe in them, and Christian Science is the thing, and you should go and burn those I Am books. I said, burn the books? I said to him, Mr. Carr, that is superstition. How can you tell me to burn the books? Well, anyway, I told my husband, whose name was Dog, that I was going to hear a lecture and a dictation, and that I had found my contact with Saint Germain, and here I was. So he looked at me and he said, you'll have to choose between me and Saint Germain. And I said to him, I already made my choice a long, long time ago. So I went off to hear this lecture and dictation, and I think that the rest is history. But there's kind of a little tail end to this story. I was very burdened, and I could not understand how I had married this person to be only married 10 months, and how did I make this mistake, and why did I do it? And so I begged Mark to tell me when I went to Washington for the July conference in 1961. And finally he relented, and he told me. And he told me of this record in Denmark that I just told you about, and of the succeeding embodiments, and that the karma had not yet been balanced until this life. And the message from El Moria was that if I had not married him and served him, that it would have taken me 9 years of general service to life to balance that karma. This is a lesson which tells us it is much easier to balance karma with an individual directly, if at all possible. And if it is indirect, it takes longer. But by the same token, when we are giving the violet flame and serving, we may be balancing karma with 10, 20,000, thousands of people at the same time. Now, had I not obeyed this inner voice and married him, what would have happened to me is I would have postponed my meeting of Saint Germain for 9 years from that time. But from the time I met Mark Prophet, it was only 12 years till he took his leave from this octave. So if I had indeed found him 9 years later, which I might not have, I would have only had 3 years of him. So by being obedient to the inner voice and serving this individual, I finished the balancing of karma. So I went back home to Boston from that July conference, back to my apartment. There was Dag. And I was in the kitchen one night, and I was preparing a meal, and I was cutting vegetables with a large knife. And he was out in the hallway. This is a very small apartment. And he started an argument with me. And he was yelling at me from the hallway, and I was in the kitchen. And I forget what the argument was about. Nothing is ever significant about arguments, but I think that he was just annoyed that I'd made the choice for Saint Germain and that it was final. So, knife in hand, I walked out into the hallway, and I started allowing myself to engage in this argument. And I looked at the knife, and I looked at him, and I dropped the knife, and I walked back into the kitchen, and I kept on with the meal. I was so very grateful to have had that teaching and to understand that I had come full circle. I was standing at that point in Denmark with that knife in my hand. And by letting go of that knife, this was the end. I had fulfilled that karma, and the relationship ended. El Morya appeared to me in Boston, told me to go to Washington to be trained as a messenger, and I divorced Dag. I'm sure it was for the better. I haven't been in contact with him since, but I'm sure he's had much greater happiness than to be married to me, serving Saint Germain, when he is a very dedicated Christian Scientist. So it was the best that could have happened, and I am profoundly grateful to the Lords of Karma for this guidance. I can only tell you the moral of the story in the first place, of course, is not to take life, because he who takes life with a sword shall also be killed by the sword. But also to make your pact with God, to listen to his voice in your heart and obey immediately, because you'll never know what turn in the road you will miss if you are not obedient. Do not be afraid to serve anyone, to sacrifice on anyone's behalf, to surrender yourself because someone needs you in some capacity. Do not be afraid to give of yourself, for you never know when that gift that you give is the paying of the last farthing that will liberate you for the next plane and a higher life. Life number 9, Paris, 11:10 to 11:55, female. I was again born into a poor family. This is after having been in this Japanese family relationship. I was a washerwoman. I had many children, at least about 9. I think my husband had left somewhere along the way. He doesn't figure much in this life. And I wasted my life. I took care of 9 children, took care of their upbringing, but spent altogether too much time chattering over the back fence with neighbors, gossiping, talking. And so my life was lived out in that kind of a situation as a washerwoman. It came time for my soul's passing, and I was on my deathbed, and a traveling priest came to give me my last rites. It was at that moment that I realized that I had wasted my life. I looked into the eyes of this priest, and I recognized his eyes. His eyes were the eyes of my twin flame. One look into his eyes, and I saw the vision of our destiny, and I saw how I had wasted that life. And so in my last breath, I cried out for another opportunity, une autre opportunité. He gave me those last rites and moved on. People have asked me if he was someone we know. No, he was just a very plain priest, a humble priest, passing by, certainly not by chance. This is one of those brief encounters with your twin flame that ties you together and prepares for a future coming again. Now we come to 1194 to 1253, female. This is the life of Claire, devotee of Francis. This is her story as we know it from history. She was born Chiara Sifi on July 16, 1194, at Assisi in Umbria, the eldest of 5 children. Her parents were of noble descent. They lived in a palace in Assisi. Her mother was notably pious. While she was in prayer just before Claire was born, she heard a voice saying to her, "Fear not, Ortolana, thou shalt safely bring forth a light, which shall enlighten the whole world clearly." Claire received her name because of the last word of this prophecy. In the year 1212, St. Francis preached a series of sermons at the church of San Giorgio in Assisi. Claire, now 18, attended those sermons and wept. She secretly left her family and went to Francis. She took her vows before him and put herself under his direction. Her relatives found her and tried to persuade her to go home, but it was no use. She and a small group of women who had chosen her life settled in a cottage next to the chapel of San Damiano. Thus, the first community of Franciscan nuns was established. Claire was one of the primary people who spread the Franciscan movement. The nuns practiced austerities unusual for women at that time. They slept on the ground, abstained from eating meat, went barefoot, and spoke only when obliged to do so. Following Francis' rule that they own no property, they received all their material necessities and sustenance from alms. Because of her austerities, Claire was almost always sick and confined to her bed. Her illness continued for the last 27 years of her life. Perhaps this teaches us somewhat of the dangers of extreme asceticism. Claire's support of St. Francis and his ministry was a large part of her mission. It was to Claire that Francis turned when in doubt, and it was she who urged him to continue his ministry to the people rather than lead a life of contemplation. One author writes, Claire was not only constant in work, she was frequent in prayer. It is told that she once stayed 3 days in a trance, and there is no doubt that she tasted the supreme bliss of the heavenly vision that is the crown and glory of the religious life. There are many legends about these later years that tell of her as the ecstatic, as the contemplative. Claire died at the age of 60. Life number 11, Siena, Italy, 1347-1380, female. Catherine of Siena. Catherine ranks among the greatest of Catholic mystics and spiritual writers. She was born the youngest of 25 children to a dyer in Siena, Italy. About the year 1354, she had a vision of Christ in glory. She vowed to remain a virgin. She devoted herself to Jesus, practicing austerities and spending many hours in prayer. In the spring of 1368, she received a vision of Christ and a command from him to carry her love for him out into the world, and so give full scope to the charity within her. She believed she was accepted as his bride and embarked on her active apostolate. She learned to write miraculously without being taught. She simply prayed to Jesus to teach her to write, and overnight she learned to write. Her biographer records that when she was a small child, not older than 7, she walked a long way from home and meditated in a cave, and that in this cave, Jesus caused her to levitate, and she was levitated for hours in this cave until nightfall came and Jesus directed her to go home. She was instrumental in convincing Pope Gregory XI to leave Avignon, France, and return to Rome. Since 1309, the church had been headquartered in decadence at Avignon. She urged him to return to Rome. After he did so, she tried unsuccessfully to make peace between the Florentines and the Pope in order to keep the church united. When her efforts failed, the Great Schism began. This was a 30-year period in which there were 2 popes. Between 1378 and 1380, she dictated her dialogues received under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. The Catholic Church has recognized these dialogues as dictations from God to St. Catherine. This is her spiritual testament to the world. Catherine died at the age of 33. She had the stigmata, and she laid down her life for the church. She gave her body and her blood that the church might survive. When Jesus gave me the mantle of the Vicar of Christ for Church Universal and Triumphant, he said he gave it to me because I had understood, as Catherine, that you support whoever the Pope is, whether he is good or evil, because you are supporting the office and the mantle, and that you do not go against the office and the mantle because its current occupant is not qualified or is in error. And so he said that because I was not attached to self, but would always defend the mantle, whoever wore it, that he placed that mantle upon me. This Jesus gave to me in 1973, the mantle of the Vicar of Christ. Life number 12 in England, 1505 to 1544, female. I was Margaret More, eldest child of Sir Thomas More. Thomas saw to it that his daughter was well educated, far beyond the standards of the time. She learned Latin, Greek, mathematics, grammar, and other subjects. She was More's favorite child and confidant. He called her Meg. She washed the hair shirt he secretly wore. She later preserved his unpublished writings. King Henry VIII appointed Thomas More Chancellor of England. When More was in favor, the king was a frequent dinner guest, but Thomas quarreled with the king over the relaxation of heresy laws. He also refused to take the oath, renouncing the Pope's jurisdiction over the church. In April 1534, More was imprisoned in the Tower of London for refusal to take an oath of adherence to the Act of Succession that vested the crown in Anne Boleyn's issue. More's imprisonment brought severe economic hardship and loss of property to his family. In May of 1534, Meg visited her father in the Tower. She begged him to reconsider his action. He refused. He was indicted on July 1, 1535, tried and sentenced to death. The following scene took place when Meg met her father on the Tower Wharf after his trial. which she did not attend. First he gave her his blessing, then she openly, in sight of them all, embraced him, took him about the neck and kissed him. He said, "Have patience, Margaret, and trouble not thyself. It is the will of God. Long hast thou known the secrets of my heart." While in prison, Moore exhibited remarkable composure and legendary good humor. On July 6, he was executed. Margaret took his headless torso for burial. His head was parboiled and exhibited on a stake on London Bridge. A year later, she bribed the executioner to give her her father's head. She preserved it in spices until her death. When I first contacted the records of this event in this life, I was still arguing with Thomas More. Don't challenge the king. Don't allow yourself to be executed. And it was like I still could not understand why he did this. Of course, I did understand in my soul, but I was contacting those records of this very painful parting of the daughter with the father. What I realized as I look back upon this life is that it prepared me for the ultimate sacrifice. It prepared me for embodiments that followed, where I was assassinated or guillotined or met an untimely death. It prepared me to be a messenger. It prepared me to stand on principles. It was a bonding of my heart to the heart of El Moria, who was embodied as St. Thomas More. I was thinking the other day, he's probably the best and greatest father I have had since that lifetime. I learned non-attachment. He instructed me by his martyrdom, his bravery. His example has never left me. I think it is the embodiment that moves me the most, although many of these move me for my memories with those who are now ascended masters. It was an amazing experience to be the daughter of Thomas More. Life number 13, Austria and France, 1755 to 1793. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. I had the recall of this life when I was studying French history in college. When I read about the flight to Varennes and the attempted escape of the king and queen, I knew that I was in that carriage. I could hear the horses. I could hear the man in his store. I could hear the entire scene. And I said, either I was the driver or the maid or the queen or the king or somebody, but I was there. I was one of the people to that scene. And I kind of concluded that I must have been Marie Antoinette. She was born November 2, 1755 at Vienna, the 11th daughter of Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I. I think you know of the tales of the great power and force of Maria Theresa. She was a very strong-willed woman, and she dominated her husband, Francis. She never stopped running and going, and basically never laid down except to have her babies. One day I was meditating upon this embodiment, and I remembered an experience of what I was thinking about when I was in her womb. And it was annoying me that she was disdainful talking down to my father. I did not like the idea that she was overpowering him and putting him down and basically taking his power. That was my observation on the scene. And There wasn't much time, of course, in those days spent by monarchs with their children. So, at age 15, she was married to the Dauphin, the grandson of France's King Louis XV. From the very first, she was caught in court intrigue. Her marriage had been arranged by those who wanted to cement an alliance with Austria. The faction that did not want the alliance opposed Marie Antoinette from the beginning. When she was 19, Louis XV died, and Marie Antoinette and her husband ascended the throne. That was Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette lived a life of pleasure and extravagance and had an obvious disregard of court etiquette that shocked many people. She inherited, of course, this court life. It was the surroundings of the court of France since Louis XIV and the court of Austria. She had enjoyed an informal upbringing at the relaxed court of Austria and was unprepared for her duties as Queen of France. Her husband was indifferent toward her. She was generally unpopular among the French people, but this was often due to newspapers circulated against her and against the king, and it is generally known that the peasants and the people outside of Paris were more favorable toward the king and queen than those in the city. In 1785, the incident called the Affair of the Diamond Necklace began. The queen was unfairly accused of an immoral relationship with a cardinal. This discredited the monarchy and finally destroyed the queen's reputation with the French people. Popular agitators accused her of having made the comment about the poor, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake." As far as historians can determine, she never said this. In fact, she was charitable to the poor. In 1789, the French Revolution began. On July 14, 1789, the mob stormed the fortress prison of the Bastille in the center of Paris. At this point, Louis XVI lost his authority. On October 6, 1789, the royal family was pressured by angry mobs to move from Versailles to the Tuileries in Paris. Through secret emissaries, Marie Antoinette implored her brother to send an Austrian army to rescue the royal family. After 2 years, help still had not arrived, so the royal family decided to leave France. On June 20, 1791, the family disguised themselves as commoners and attempted to escape from Paris. They were discovered at Varennes, captured and forced to return to Paris, where they were closely guarded. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal and found guilty. On October 16, 1793, she was guillotined. My recollection of these events is an amazing one. I remember being in prison for a number of years. The story goes that she was served on a giant silver platter with a cover on it, the head of her lady in waiting. Many cruelties and brutalities were practiced against her. She was not well. She rode in the cart to the guillotine. The guillotine, the place where these events happened, I believe, is beneath the statue of Justice, who is blindfolded, holding the scales. At the point at which I was guillotined, Saint-Germain, the Count Saint-Germain, was standing there. He took me to the octaves of light and to the retreat of the great divine director in India following that embodiment. There are many different accounts of the life of the king and queen, some favorable, some not so favorable. You can see, or we will see, the end to this tale when I get to the end of this document. The next life is Austria, life number 14, 1837 to 1898, female. Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie, Empress of Austria, born December 24, 1837, at Possenhofen Castle near Munich. She was the daughter of the Bavarian Duke Maximilian Joseph. She received an unconventional education. She accompanied her eccentric father on hunting expeditions. She became an expert rider and climber. In August 1853, she met her cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph I, ruler of Austria. He fell in love with her at first sight. He was 23, she was 15. They were married and she became empress. Life was difficult from the start. The emperor had numerous love affairs. His involvements in state business left him little time for Elizabeth. One of her confidants wrote, he believed her to be too young, too inexperienced, and too indifferent to become his real companion and comrade. She bore 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. The first daughter died in infancy. The Archduchess, Franz Joseph's mother, forbade her to raise her own children, claiming she was only a child herself. Her exceptional beauty, charm, and generosity made her popular with her subjects, but her impatience with the Viennese court etiquette, her love for horsemanship, and frequent visits to the imperial riding school scandalized Austrian high society. She exhibited great compassion for the common people and tended the wounded during the 7 Weeks' War. She began to spend more time away from court. In November 1860, she separated from her husband over his infidelities. They were estranged for 7 years. She spent the time traveling and learning Latin and Greek. She involved herself in state affairs on behalf of the people of Hungary. She learned the Magyar language and helped to arrange the Compromise of 1867, which raised Hungary to equal status with Austria in the empire. She was also involved in charitable work. In 1889, her only son, the Crown Prince Archduke Rudolph, committed suicide. Elizabeth never fully recovered from this shock. On September 10, 1898, she was assassinated by the Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini while visiting Geneva, Switzerland. She was walking from her hotel in Geneva when she was stabbed. At Lucchini's trial, he stated that human suffering was the motive for his act. I considered her death to be the funeral knell of the bourgeoisie, whom I detest, he said. She is remembered as being independent, unconventional, high-spirited, and possessed of exceptional intelligence and kindness. When I was 17, I walked in the very places where she was in Geneva. I stood at the place where this anarchist drove a carefully filed piece of metal into her heart. After that, she walked to the boat and laid down and passed on at that point. I believe that I have met all of these characters in this life, including the characters that were surrounding Marie Antoinette, characters surrounding Elizabeth of Austria. Met them in very personal ways and some in distant ways, and wherever there was karma, I had to balance that karma. I think I've told you about 3 different deaths: assassination of Nefertiti, guillotine of Marie Antoinette, the stabbing of Elizabeth of Austria. It's interesting because the Habsburgs' clothing was on display in the New York Metropolitan Museum a number of years ago, and they had on a form of her, a figure of her, a complete model, the dress she was wearing when she was assassinated. And I approached the dress, and there was this tiny hole over the heart where the instrument had gone through the dress in that killing. So what we are seeing here and what we're not seeing, which is many, many other lifetimes, I think that the Karmic Board has given me the opportunity to be embodiment almost continuously, with very little time out of embodiment, to be sure that I would be ready for this life and this mission and all that we would have to do. And so I think that there have probably been plenty of other embodiments of this type of death and this type of scene. I have also recognized that in this life, I seem to have what has always followed me: many people who love me and many people who hate me. I don't seem to draw any neutrals in this matter. People polarize very quickly. So I have asked myself, of course, aside from the fallen angels and reprobate ones who could not be converted back to God and who have made themselves my enemies, Why have people hated me? Why have they really hated me in other embodiments? And so I asked El Morya to please give me an understanding of this for this lecture. And so I have that record, which has just come to me in the past couple of weeks, and it does give me the profound understanding of where I have been all of these centuries and what I have been doing besides what you know I have been doing in the embodiments that I've told you about. Where did my karma come from? Where did I make this karma of being vulnerable to assassination, etc.? This is the second embodiment that I saved for the end. It is Atlantis, about 25,000 BC, which puts this 27,000 years ago, a very long time ago. It was a time of decline in the then civilization. I became a queen ruling over much of the continent. I began with good intentions and was benevolent at first. I wanted to make people do what was best for themselves and each other. I established laws about dress, moral conduct, family responsibility, alcohol consumption. I also established laws forbidding usury, slave trafficking, unfair business practices, racketeering, and mistreatment of workers. In the beginning, the common people praised the laws because they thought they would get a better shake. But the penalties were harsh, and they were carried out without mercy. The people then turned against me and my laws. To counteract that, I did what the rulers of the time did. I had a network of spies that carried out assassinations of those who opposed me. Many people were executed for the sins of adultery, drunkenness, stealing, and so on. It was my position that I hoped against hope that they might be convinced to change their ways once they discovered that I was in earnest and that I would not bend on the reforms. But this did not happen. Instead, they rioted. I was asked to step down by the nation's Council of Elders for the sake of national unity. I abdicated and lived the rest of my life in exile. But I had made a karma that I would have to balance in succeeding lives. I wish to tell you that not until this lifetime did I finally balance this karma when in 1980 I balanced 100% of my karma. I am very grateful to be able to give you this record today. Sometimes people, like reporters and so on, have asked me, why are you always somebody important or a queen or something in your past lives? Well, first of all, I tell them I wasn't certainly always such. We have many dips in our sine wave of embodiments, and they cover the lowest and the highest in terms of our station in life. But one of the reasons I have been a queen when I have been a queen is because I have queen's karma. And there's only one way to balance queen's karma. You have to get back and be a queen again. So this is that point of origin, 27,000 years ago. I would have to contact many people, and I would have to give to them the complete balancing of whatever happened to them in that life, whether they were assassinated, whether they were killed, or whether they were simply deprived or mistreated or whatever. So I can see that this could take a long, long time, depending on how long such things would be going on. I also want to comment about this embodiment in conclusion. And I want to say that I can feel in the record of my own soul that there came a time after many, many, many thousands of years of having gone forth to bring these reprobate ones back to God, that I was no longer reacting to them from the centeredness of God manifestation. But their rejection of God and his message and his law and his teaching was causing me to become more and more angered inside, that I couldn't woo them back to God, so now I was going to create a situation where they would have to, in order to survive and to live, obey these laws whereby they would be on the right side. The interesting thing is that in the teachings of Philos the Tibetan, we find that the Rai of the Swearneys, Rai Ernan, was the one who forced his people into a certain moral code and a certain standard of preserving the sacred fire, and the people hated him. They hated him to the last man. And he spoke about this in a dictation that he gave, and saying that it is the absolute conclusion of the ascended masters of the Great White Brotherhood that you cannot force laws, morals, standards, honor, a spiritual path, a spiritual discipline upon anyone. You can set the example, you can give the teaching, you can urge them, you can preach to them, you can love them, you can do everything that you can possibly do. But you cannot force an individual, a people, a nation, a church to do something because you say it is true, even if it is true. And so the greatest of ascended masters bow to the light within us, and they withdraw when we do not receive from them their teaching. In a very small scale, you can apply this lesson to your own life. Your husband, your wife, your children, your relatives do not have to be students of the ascended masters. They may very well make it to heaven without being students of the ascended masters. The important thing here is that you should not worry about them and burden yourself. You should be an example, a living example of the path and the teaching, and an example of love. Some will receive you and love you, some will hate you. You just be that teaching, but don't try to force it on anyone. And so there has been a great mellowing in my heart through all the ages, and in a few of these embodiments you can see of my deep desire to serve Jesus Christ and Saint Francis and many who were a part of the brothers and sisters. And surely it has been my desire to see the preservation of the Catholic Church. In this lifetime I was born outside of the church, but with a great love for Mother Mary and the saints. And I realized that God did not allow me to be born to this church because I had already given my life to the church, and I must go outside it to preach the word of God. Mother Mary's appearance at Knock with John the Beloved and St. Joseph. But that appearance is striking because it was an appearance in which she was standing outside of the church, not inside the church, which has been true of her appearances in any case. And it showed me that she was coming to the people directly and bypassing the hierarchy. And so often she appears to children because they are receptive. So we can see in these embodiments of mine and of those whose stories preceded this, that it has taken most of the people to come to this day and age about 30,000 years since their karma began, or thereabouts. And if I didn't give a lifetime that far back for some people, you can be sure that they had one. So I would like you, if you haven't read it, to read the book of Philos the Tibetan to get a deeper understanding of this. And as I said earlier, to also take my tapes and study them. I hope that this lecture has brought to you a real depth of soul understanding for your own life and for your own actions. And I hope I've convinced you that karma is a reality. And perhaps I might even have convinced you that reincarnation is a reality. Thank you. did want to say to you that I asked for my karma at birth and I received it. And I was aware that I was surrounded by many burdens in the first 18 years of my life. And as I look back on it, I was absolutely certain that every single person that came into my life was some karmic situation that needed to be settled. It was not an easy life, but I walked with God as I walked with my understanding of God through Christian Science, and I had great experiences of light. But when I came to leave my home and I asked God what He had placed there for me, and the voice spoke clearly in my heart and in my mind to get the I Am discourses and read them that were on my mother's shelf. And then I opened the book and I saw a portrait of Saint Germain, and I was electrified. I realized later that Saint Germain was standing right there, but I could not see him because of the very, very dense food that I had eaten in the tradition of my parents' cooking. And yet I was aware, I was electrified, and my inner being knew that I had to find him. But the comment that he made to me, which was very interesting, which I think all of us should take to heart many years later in reflecting upon that moment, he said to me, "You had 18 years, so to speak, as an indentured servant, and you had to serve these parents and serve all the people you knew and help all the people you helped." I never stopped helping people, friends, neighbors, schoolmates, whatever. Whatever people needed, I would help them with. And it was a life of service, and it was a difficult situation. But he said that I had behaved as a chela in terms of respecting my parents, even if their behavior was not always respectable. I respected their office, I was obedient to them, and I did not challenge them. And what he was saying is that I had passed my tests, balanced the karma I was intended to balance in that town and in that situation, and had I not done so, he would not have come to me at the age of 18 in answer to my prayer, quickened me, and showed me the book and showed me his portrait in that book and given me that impetus for the quest of finding him and finding him personally. You might remember that Saint Germain came to the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to warn Louis XVI of the coming revolution. Louis XVI listened to his advisors and not to Saint Germain, but on numerous occasions, Marie Antoinette was present when Saint Germain, the Count Saint Germain, came to converse with the king. And so there was a very direct memory of Saint Germain in that life and other past lives. I am certainly devoted to Saint Germain with all of my heart because I remember how gracious he has been to me in so many lifetimes, and the same is true of so many ascended masters. I advise you, again, in conclusion, to listen to the voice of God in your heart, and don't ever be afraid to give of yourself to people, to those around you. Don't ever be afraid to obey the voice of God within, because it will always lead you back to Him and never lead you astray, no matter how odd or how funny it might seem. Listen to that voice. Know that it is God's voice, and when you know it is God's voice, follow it.
The preceding lecture was given by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, world-renowned author and spiritual teacher. The Summit Lighthouse is an international spiritual organization dedicated to universal enlightenment. Founded in 1958, the Summit Lighthouse has been a beacon of truth to thousands worldwide and a leader in New Thought spirituality. The preceding program has been brought to you by the Summit Lighthouse. For more information, call 1-800-245-5445 or visit our website at www.tsl.org. Outside the USA, call 406-848-9500 or write to the Summit Lighthouse, 63 Summit Way, Gardner, Montana, 59030, USA.